Thank you, Stuart, and hopefully people can hear me again. I'm having trouble with the technology. Delighted to be able to introduce this lecture to be given by Louis this evening. I have the pleasure to give him the biography. So Louis was born in Johannesburg, South Africa, and obtained his university education, including his LLD at Northwest University. In 2002, he was appointed junior lecturer there, and in 2009, he was appointed full professor. In 2016, he was appointed as one of the university's 5 research professors, a position in which he still serves. He teaches international and African regional environmental law on the LLM program at that institution. He was recently rated by the South African National Research Foundation as a leading international scholar in the field. After completion of his doctoral degree, which was partly funded by the Finnish government, Louis was awarded an Alexander von Humboldt Fellowship and spent 2 years at the Max Planck Institute in Heidelberg, Germany. Louis is also the recipient of both the Austrian and German Exchange Service Awards, which allowed him to spend several periods of time working at various universities and research institutes in those 2 countries. His research broadly encompasses 3 interrelated themes that he approaches from a transnational perspective: environmental constitutionalism, law in the Anthropocene, and Earth system law. The latter concept he has pioneered with Professor Rat Kim from Utrecht University. Louis has over 160 publications on these themes, and unsurprisingly, he is frequently invited to speak at academic and scientific outreach events around the globe. Louis has a long and distinguished relationship with the University of Lincoln. He joined the University in Lincoln in 2020 as a senior professorial fellow in Earth system law. Prior to this, he'd spent several years as a visiting professor here and collaborated with numerous colleagues in the law school. He was awarded then a European Commission Horizon 2020 Marie Curie Fellowship here to lead a research project during 2018 to 2019 entitled Global Ecological Custodianship. And I was honoured to be the academic host for that visit. This research period led to several publications in leading law journals and ultimately to the publication of a co-edited book, which I was very happy and pleased to be involved with, the Research Handbook on Law, Governance and Planetary Boundaries. This was the first scholarly work to offer a detailed analysis of the interplay between law, governance and the global challenges that we on the planet face. It was endorsed by those pioneers of the concept of planetary boundaries, which both Louis and I were very honoured to receive, Professors Will Steffen and Johan Rockström. Louis is assistant editor of the journal Earth System Governance, a senior fellow of the Earth System Governance Network, and co-convener of its task force on Earth System Law. In 2016, he obtained a second PhD. I barely survived my first, so I don't know how he got a second at Tilburg University in the Netherlands. And he has most recently been awarded the prestigious Klaus Tupfers Sustainability Fellowship by the Potsdam Institute for 2022. Now, whilst in Heidelberg, he met his partner Klaus, and contrary to many expectations, he says, including his own, they are still together. So, ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to ask Louis to give this lecture, Earth System Law for the Anthropocene. Louis.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Thank you very much, Duncan, for these incredibly kind words of welcome. I am going to try and share my screen. If you could just give me 1 second. There we go. I assume you would be able to see it.
Excellent, that's there. Thank you, Louis.
Wonderful. So good evening, everyone. I really wish to thank you all for taking the time to be here tonight. I realize it is a difficult both time of the day and certainly also a time of the year with the start of the academic year for many of us and the end of the academic year for others of us. And I also recognize already in the list of attendees some close friends and colleagues, and some of you I've never met, and I'm really extremely grateful that you could take the time to spend tonight with us. And I also want to thank you for the opportunity, certainly, for giving me that you are giving me to speak about a topic that lies very close to my heart and that forms the main focus of my professional work currently, and that is the topic of Earth system law. And I hope to share with you tonight some thoughts on why I believe it's time to urgently reimagine environmental law for the purpose of the Anthropocene, which is, as many of you would know, the human-dominated geological epoch we now live in. We need a new legal paradigm that is better fit for purpose in the Anthropocene, called Earth system law. Now, despite its noble intentions and some victories, I think environmental law has been and continues to be complicit in driving the processes and the paradigms that give rise to the markers of the Anthropocene, such as global plastics pollution, climate change, and so forth. And environmental law, both as a discipline and as a body of norms, is unable to respond properly to the regulatory challenges that arise from the Anthropocene's complex Earth system context. And I think a key reason for environmental law's failures and an obstacle preventing its transformation is its reluctance to embrace and respond to the notion of the Earth system. So my proposal is that the Earth system metaphor should be key in rethinking environmental law, with the ultimate view to constructing Earth system law for the Anthropocene. And in this lecture, we will explore what the Earth system metaphor entails and what it might imply for environmental law's transformation to Earth system law. My apologies, I am trying to, there we go. So let us start, perhaps rather counterintuitively, with the conclusion, and that is, what is Earth system law? Earth system law is defined as an innovative legal imaginary that is rooted in the Anthropocene's planetary context, as well as its perceived socio-ecological crisis. Earth system law is aligned with and responsive to the Earth system's functional, spatial, and temporal complexities, as well as the multiple Earth system science and social science-based governance challenges arising from a no-analog state in which the Earth system currently operates. So, in a sense, Earth system law seeks to respond to the Earth system's instability, unpredictability, and complexity, especially to the extent that all of this manifests as governance challenges emanating from an unstable, unpredictable, and complex Earth system. Now, Rak Kim and I believe that Earth system law offers an alternative framing for law to facilitate the type of transformations and governance interventions that are actually in step with the continuously transforming Earth system, and that are required to address the socio-ecological crisis of the Anthropocene and the multiple governance challenges arising from this crisis. So the purpose of Earth system law is to align law with an Earth system perspective in the most simplest of terms. And it does so by prompting lawyers and policymakers to discard our Holocene-based, the previous geological epoch, assumptions of one-dimensional linearity, predictability, simplicity, and even harmony, on which much of environmental law, I think, still rests, and instead to embrace an alternative understanding of the role and contribution of law in governing complex, nonlinear, interconnected, multi-scalar, and certainly unpredictable Earth system governance challenges that arise in the Anthropocene. So in terms of such a description of Earth system law, And there are other descriptions as well, as we see in the emerging literature. Earth system law is perhaps not so much a new body of law as it is a vision or imaginary of what law in its broadest sense could be or could become for the purpose of facilitating the legal aspects of governance in an Earth system context. So Earth system law is a way of seeing the law through the lens of the Earth system, if you want. It is about exploring the plurality of ways in an intradisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and certainly also a transdisciplinary sense about how the Earth system metaphor could inspire innovative legal responses to and reforms of social behavior, and certainly also reforms of the law itself to confront head-on the complex challenges posed by the Earth system. Now, what has prompted the development of this new legal paradigm? The rapidly deteriorating state of the Earth system has now become starkly evident through the lens of the Anthropocene. Now, the Anthropocene is the proposed, but still unofficial, new geological epoch following the more stable, harmonious, predictable Holocene. And it tells us that we live in a new period in geological time where humans dominate the Earth system. Now, the Anthropocene reveals the significant power of humans to cause harm to planet Earth. Similar to volcanoes, erosion, and earthquakes, for example, humans have now assumed the power to change other components and processes of the Earth system. So in a sense, humans have become volcanoes. And we have assumed the power of volcanoes in the sense that we can affect the type of changes that these geological forces do. Humans are not external to nature, but instead we are a central part of an interlinked Earth system that we also influence through our primal urges, our cultures, our beliefs, our efforts to survive and certainly to dominate, and our intrinsic desire to master other vulnerable humans and non-humans. So if the Anthropocene shows us that we are able and capable, in fact, to destroy a planet, it also reveals very clearly, I think, the urgent need for thoroughgoing social transformations and a step change in and of our social regulatory institutions, such as law, and certainly including law, if we want to survive and ensure the survival of all life on Earth. Now, while it is the main body of law designed to ensure environmental protection, recent research clearly reveals environmental law's failures. Despite many successes and triumphs over the years. And this research also shows environmental law's structural complicity in creating the conditions that drive the Anthropocene, such as its promotion of new liberal anthropocentric forms of so-called sustainable development, which many critical environmental lawyers such as Sam Edelman from Warwick University and Anna Greer from Cardiff, for example, have exposed for its predatory tendencies, and it's a form of greenwashing. It's also exposing environmental law's inability to halt, reverse, and remedy socio-ecological damage and resultant injustices, as the lackluster global climate change regime certainly very aptly suggests, and its lack of regulatory ambition, as Duncan and I have argued in several papers that we've done together in relation to addressing global sustainability. And this again is very much and particularly evident in the lack of binding higher order ecological norms, certainly in international environmental law. So particularly, and perhaps even more relevant for present purposes, architecture of environmental law, including its core assumptions, its orientation, its operation and objectives are not commensurate with the most recent understanding of the many regulatory challenges that arise from within a deeply complex and interlinked Earth system in the context of the Anthropocene. So scholars agree that when it comes to reforming environmental law in the light of a possible new geological epoch, the Anthropocene requires far more than merely tinkering at the margins. We do not only require reforms currently driven by non-committal global political processes involving high rhetoric and little definitive action that are squarely focused on generating more, or perhaps, if we are lucky, slightly improved environmental laws. Such an unambitious approach remains firmly entrenched in the comfortable and accommodative, but deeply deceiving confines of a business as usual approach. And again, we see this transpiring in Glasgow as we speak to one another tonight. We arguably need a new legal paradigm that is better fit for purpose in the unstable Anthropocene. And as a minimum, such a new paradigm must depart from ecological dynamism or complexity, and it must fully embrace the Earth system's key characteristics, such as interconnectedness, unpredictability, instability, and complexity, instead of taking Holocene stability and harmony for granted. It must also discard, certainly, its singular focus on the environment as its regulatory object, and instead focus on a much more broadly conceived Earth system. So several terms have already been suggested for such a new legal paradigm, including terms such as Earth-centered law, Anthropocene law, and even planetary boundaries law. And while all of these obviously have merit in their right, my principal proposal is that the Earth system metaphor should be key in rethinking environmental law in the Anthropocene. And such a systems perspective that is fully anchored in the Anthropocene's planetary context is, I think, most accurately captured by the notion of Earth system law. Now, in order to identify, understand, and describe the regulatory implications of the Earth system metaphor for environmental law, it's useful to first try and understand what the Earth system means. And while some specifics vary, obviously, between different descriptions, in general terms, the Earth system includes a number of components and associated processes, and these include, firstly, the physical world, consisting of the geosphere, the hydrosphere, the cryosphere, and the atmosphere. Secondly, the biological world, including the biosphere, in other words, all those parts containing life. And thirdly, the mental world of the Anthroposphere, also called the technosphere, which includes all those parts made or modified by humans. And these components, as you will also see in the figure on the slide, do not exist and operate in isolation. They are all very much deeply interconnected. Whether one is affected, so too will the other. For example, cutting down the Amazon rainforest means there are less trees to absorb CO2, which causes global warming, and consequently droughts in Africa and floods in Europe, as we currently see. Now, the Earth system therefore consists of all interacting physical, chemical, and biological global scale cycles and energy fluxes, which collectively provide the conditions necessary to enable and, of course, to sustain life on Earth. It is a materially closed system consisting of interlinked physical, chemical, and biological processes that cycle materials and energy in complex and dynamic ways within the system. And all living organisms, humans included, of course, are active participants in and not simply passive respondents to or observers of the system. Now, the idea of the Earth system has become a very popular framework in the domain of Earth system science, certainly, to describe, understand, and to respond to the complex interactions between Earth system components and processes, including exploring potential pathways to address Earth system vulnerability and to ensure resilience. Now, the idea of the Earth being a complex integrated system was already suggested as far back as the 1700s by scientists such as Alexander von Humboldt. In the early 1970s, much more recently, obviously, James Lovelock introduced the term Gaia, which described Earth as a single living organism and consisting of tightly coupled feedback systems. At around the same time, interestingly, in 1972, the Apollo 17 image of Earth, or the blue marble as we all know it, presented the first image of Earth as an entire entity, which offered humans quite literally a visual planetary perspective of the planet that we live on. And at the global policy level, even, the United Nations chose the slogan, "Only One Earth," as the leitmotif for its first major global conference on the human environment that was held in Stockholm in 1972, an event that obviously formally marked also the birth of international environmental law. So in doing so, the United Nations endorsed the view, if only symbolically, that a single united population inhabiting a single planet needs to govern its own future. So in essence, all of this brief historical evolution of the Earth system metaphor has occurred as a response to the deficiencies, scientific, regulatory, and otherwise, resulting from a traditional linear, one-dimensional, and segmented approach to understanding and responding to what we perceive to be discrete, unrelated, localized environmental problems that only occur in specific and disconnected geographic locations. So in stark contrast to this reductionist approach, the significantly more all-embracing Earth system metaphor instead shifts its holistic focus to the planetary scale. And in doing so, it extends Earth system science inquiry into new areas, seeking to understand complex and dynamic human and non-human relationships, complex self-organizing systems, and irreversible impacts of interacting stresses, multiple scales of organization, and of course, the various actors and their agendas that influence Earth system change. Now, what does all of this have to do with environmental law, you might very rightly ask? Environmental law is part of the social sciences. And although social scientists increasingly recognize the significance of humans as a driving force of Earth system change, the relevance of the Earth system metaphor for many years largely remained confined to the Earth system science domain. Certainly geography, geology, and climate sciences. Very few deliberate attempts at translating its relevance and implications into the social sciences domain. However, since the early 2000s, the Earth system metaphor has been popularized in the social sciences by the introduction of the concept of the Anthropocene, and later by the associated imagery of the planetary boundaries theory, which reveals the deeply linked social and ecological aspects of the Earth system, and certainly also the limits to the Earth system. Now, the planetary boundaries framework that you also see on the slide suggests it's possible to identify and quantify a set of 9 planetary boundaries that are comprehensible only in a complex global system perspective. And these boundaries define the safe operating space for humanity with respect to the Earth system and are associated with the planet's biophysical subsystems or processes. If the planetary boundaries are crossed, the chance of maintaining relatively stable Holocene-like conditions for human existence significantly diminishes as we step closer to so-called tipping points in the Earth system. And we have already crossed 4 of the 9 planetary boundaries, according to a recent estimation. Now, possibly inaugurating an important and timely cognitive shift, the holistic vision of the Earth system is seen through the lens of the Anthropocene and the planetary boundaries has gradually become a concern, regulatory object, and objective, even a perspective of, and a guiding narrative in a range of human efforts to think about, design, and in ways to survive an unstable and unpredictable human-dominated geological epoch. Now, the burgeoning field of Earth system governance that has been pioneered by Professor Frank Biermann since 2002 is perhaps the clearest example of the Earth system metaphor's attempts to infiltrate the social sciences. And it serves as a stark contrast to environmental law and its lawyers, myself included, continued ambivalence towards and reluctance to really fully embrace an Earth system understanding and an Earth system perspective. And the challenge of Earth system governance, as Frank Biermann says, is to respond to the serious mismatch, between the research and recommendations of Earth system analysts and the actions of political decision makers who still operate within the parameters of a nation-state system inherited from the 20th century. So policymakers in the 20th century gained much experience, certainly, in managing confined ecosystems such as river basins, forests, or even lakes. But in the 21st century, we are now faced with one of the largest governance challenges humankind has ever had to deal with, namely protecting the entire Earth system. And for their part, environmental law and environmental lawyers, with obvious exceptions, have not yet meaningfully embraced the Earth system metaphor, although some environmental lawyers are admittedly also now extending their research into the domain of law and the Anthropocene, and certainly also into the domain of transnational environmental law or global environmental law, which orientates much more towards a complex, pluralist, and holistic approach that is not jurisdictionally bounded as compared to traditional monist, state-bound and top-down international environmental law. Now, this is not to say that lawyers are not aware and critical of the many shortcomings of environmental law. In fact, the burgeoning body of critical environmental law scholarship suggests quite the contrary. What it does suggest, I think, is that on balance, environmental lawyers might not yet fully appreciate some of the possible far-reaching implications of the Earth system perspective for environmental law, and or they might not see the need for a wholesale new legal paradigm for the Anthropocene, and instead might opt to pursue the status quo and incremental reforms of the current body of environmental law. And this might have to change. For as long as environmental law remains part of the human system, as it will predictably, it will have to contribute to enable a future that accommodates all life equally and harmoniously in the midst of a disrupted Earth system. And if this is indeed the case, it is doubtful whether environmental law, either in its current form or in a mildly revised guise, would be up to the task. So the scientific, intellectual, and regulatory challenges presented by Earth's complex system vividly illuminate why environmental law that does not embrace an Earth system metaphor and respond to its challenges will arguably be unsuitable for the purpose of surviving the Anthropocene. Now, if this is the challenge for environmental law, what will it take for environmental law and its lawyers to more fully embrace the Earth system perspective, or to be more blunt, to move from environmental law to Earth system law? And I will just speak about three considerations for the purpose of this discussion. First, I think it is important that environmental law will have to immerse itself more fully in the growing interdisciplinary Earth system science effort on which it should draw. Now, Earth system lawyers could capitalize certainly on existing interdisciplinary knowledge and experience by first trying to understand what the Earth system means in general terms and for environmental law specifically. Earth system science already offers a comprehensive natural science-based insights into what the Earth system is, how humans and other forces impact the system, and the type, range, and depth of possible challenges that arise from these impacts that will have to be addressed. Second, environmental law must reorganize itself around systems thinking. And this is a point that I've been trying to make throughout this conversation. The resultant body of Earth system law should enable us to see the bigger picture and to comprehensively and more effectively respond to the regulatory challenges of the Earth system. So fully embracing a systems approach would allow Earth system law to respond not only to so-called environmental issues, but also to a far broader range of reciprocally interlinked challenges of the entire Earth system. Now, I would argue that many environmental lawyers are not always predisposed to think in terms of systems. And that is to say, not all of us depart from and always embrace systems-orientated ontologies, effectively shutting out, as thus inevitably does, the ability to characterize environmental law, and perhaps more critically, the regulatory object of environmental law, the planet, in terms of deeply intertwined systems. We have neither been trained to do so, nor does our discipline, its science and legal practice necessarily demand it. We see this in the neatly compartmentalized textbooks we write and read, the issue-specific courses we teach and study, and in the way we apply environmental law. For example, environmental law is distinctly unsystemized and compartmentalized geographically, international, regional, national, local, according to its subject area and regulatory object that are often treated as distinct and unrelated areas: ocean governance, plastics pollution, biodiversity conservation, and so forth. In terms of the narrow spectrum of its normativity, binding norms seems to be preferred over non-binding norms, although admittedly this is starting to change. In terms of its temporal dimension, environmental law mostly focuses on the past and present, and not also on the future, despite its high rhetoric of future generations. And certainly in terms of environmental law's one-dimensional preoccupation with addressing obvious externalities that manifest clearly and that can be proven, instead of also the past, present, and future systemic drivers of these externalities and their possible unclear speculative effects that have not yet materialized. So how then do we get from here to there? From environmental law to Earth system law. Now, the Earth system metaphor's full embrace of systems thinking, I think, can help environmental law and lawyers to relearn and to go back to the basics of understanding the system qualities also of environmental law. Perhaps starting with the fact that law is itself a system, as Gunther Teubner has convincingly showed. So to this end, the Earth system metaphor offers an opportunity to perceive the bigger picture, to ask and answer the genuine systems questions. So viewing the Earth as a system enables us to better appreciate that environmental law's problems are not only environmental, they are deeply interlinked, multi-scalar and temporal, socio-economic, health and political issues, and they are caused by non-human and human forces. By way of a simple example, amending a local environmental ordinance to periodically increase penalties for a coal power plant situated on the banks of a river close to Lincoln, that power plant pollutes, will always remain an important method of deterrence. In addition, however, Earth system approach, I think, would also require holistic reforms that aim to tackle not only the negative externalities of such pollution, but also the structural processes underlying the causes of that pollution and the causes of the power plant being there in the first place. For example, including economic and consumption drivers that encourage development of coal power stations in Lincolnshire, spatial planning laws that allow such facilities to be built in sensitive areas, international relations and trade laws regulating the export or import of electricity to another country, investment laws that must ideally encourage the expansion of renewable energies, and labor and social security laws even, allowing laborers to work often for minimum wages in the coal mines that feed the power plant. So in this view, the specific localized environmental problem in Lincoln becomes a global Earth system problem that requires a holistic response from an Earth system-oriented body of law. And third and finally, to the extent that the Earth system metaphor illuminates how deeply intertwined the biosphere and geosphere are, it works to reconnect humans with an externalized, submissive, and compliant nature that lies somewhere out there, a beautiful forest that we see from afar, that can somehow be managed, forestry management, for example, by powerful humans. And such a recognition is occurring consequent on the Earth system metaphor's imagery of interconnectivity, the Anthropocene's emphasis of humans as a critical part of the Earth system, and not merely observers or external parties to that system, and the associated awareness of the profound role and power of humans in transforming the Earth system, alongside a realization that how we use this awareness will shape the Earth's future and the future of all life, not only our own. So such a perspective, I think, consequently shows that the Earth system is vulnerable and that humans are also vulnerable as a result of our own doing. We are merely a small but influential part of a vulnerable Earth system. We are neither as invincible as we think we are, nor are the laws we design to maintain deliberate patterns of advantage for a few able to maintain such selective privilege ad infinitum. The Anthropocene instead exposes, I think, the fraud and the deception by which a highly selective group of privileged, consumptive and exploitative humans have been masking their co-responsibility for Earth system destruction. And this is a process that has already started with colonialism, right through the Industrial Revolution, up until the moment we find ourselves in today. And as a counter-narrative, the Anthropocene's imagery of a vulnerable Earth system increasingly prompts new calls for thought and action that can imagine different relationships between geological time, the culture logics of capital and accumulation, and the ontological realities of our species being. And these new calls for thought and action, as Inaugural says, are also deeply ethical. There has never been a time when human history and the history of the Earth was so deeply intertwined as it is right now. Attempts to grapple with this insight cannot be resolved through scientific questioning alone, and ought to give rise to an appreciation of the uniqueness and integrity of each component of the Earth system, humans included, and the world as a relational whole, as Peter Burden argues. So the implication of such a realization and the need for new imaginations could shake environmental law to its core, I think. In addition to becoming systems-oriented, as we have discussed earlier, environmental law will arguably have to be more sensitive and responsive to Earth system vulnerability, which is an all-embracing notion that potentially includes the human and non-human elements of the Earth system, by explicitly emphasizing the fact that human vulnerability is intertwined with non-human vulnerability. So in practical terms, Earth system law must be far more focused on protecting non-humans and particular vulnerable segments of society, especially, for example, poor women and children living in the global south. Not because such an endeavor would benefit humans, but because Earth system law must adhere to an ethical obligation to address Earth system vulnerability in its widest sense by extending juridical care to law's non-traditional subjects. And such an approach, I think, should depart from the view that humans are dependent not only on one another, but on a series of transhuman systems. And this interdependence is a source of resilience, but also of vulnerability. And we already see encouraging signs of what is possible in this respect, emerging from around the globe, certainly in the form of rights of nature in countries such as India, Bolivia, Ecuador, and New Zealand, and mostly stemming from indigenous laws and cosmovisions and their altogether more embracing ontologies of care Such alternative framings offer valuable examples of how Earth system law could discard the human as its main concern, while at once being more sensitive to the vulnerability concerns of the entire living order, indeed of the entire Earth system. In conclusion, the Earth system metaphor, I think, challenges us to discard what we think we know about environmental law's role in addressing the many regulatory challenges emanating from a complex Earth system in the Anthropocene. And to this end, the Earth system metaphor suggests we need a new legal paradigm for the Anthropocene. And I've suggested in this lecture that the evolving notion of Earth system law could be such a new legal paradigm, although I absolutely recognize that there might be others as well. Now, the development of Earth system law will require considerable creative out-of-the-box thinking, alongside the imagery of the Earth system described earlier. And this will not be a straightforward process. After all, little is more difficult than learning to think differently. Yet it's hard to even define the principal problems without upsetting long-standing traditions, beliefs, attitudes, and the often unspoken assumptions on which we build our lives. Are we willing and will we ultimately be able to upset our traditions, beliefs, attitudes when it comes to thinking about a different type of law that might be better fit for purpose in the Anthropocene? I've specifically endeavored to describe why I think the Earth system metaphor could be relevant for and valuable in guiding the transformation of environmental law into a more fully systems-oriented legal paradigm for the Anthropocene that is commensurate with a complex Earth system and its many regulatory and existential challenges. Well, only time obviously will tell. The ideas of it here, I hope, could present a small tentative step towards challenging some of our steadfast beliefs and assumptions related to the contribution of law more generally and environmental law specifically in governing Earth system challenges. In doing so, these ideas might ultimately prompt us to imagine Earth system law for the Anthropocene. And many scholars, or several scholars, and I also see some of them attending this lecture, for which I'm very grateful, are starting to look at how Earth system law could be reimagined in the Anthropocene. And there are some examples also that I've placed on the slide. And finally, I just want to say that I'm absolutely delighted that the University of Lincoln is playing a leading role globally in developing Earth system law, if possibly not the leading role. I'm both honored and proud to be associated with this institution, its work and its people. And in particular, I'm grateful to Professor Duncan French, who has had the vision to support the university's pioneering efforts to become the center of major scientific and science for society developments around Earth system law. So Lincoln is a small city with an incredibly big heart, and I'm proud to be part of this wonderful community. Thank you to the University of Lincoln, to everyone in Lincoln, to all the colleagues and friends who have taken the time to be here tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Louis, and thank you so much for such a thought-provoking talk. So while I allow some time for the audience to write questions into the chat channel, I might take the opportunity to ask one myself. Your approach has lots of benefits, clearly. I just wonder, is there a risk that, considering the interdependency and the interlinking of things, it becomes more complex and perhaps more detached from real people's understanding of law, and perhaps even to the extent that lawyers can't manage the complexities and the interactions? Do you consider that a risk?
Thank you, Stephen. That certainly is a risk, and that is one that we need to be aware of, on the one hand. On the other hand, J.B. Rule, the famous environmental lawyer, is also famous for saying, the solution to environmental law is to make a mess of it. And by that he meant, I think, that more complexity is good. The more complex the greater the degree of complexity with which we view our legal interventions with respect to Earth system governance, the better. But certainly we would need to be critically aware when thinking conceptually, because this is all that I've been doing up until now, thinking conceptually about Earth system law. When this starts to get translated into practice, and we really come to grips with the nuts and the bolts of it and how it could be implemented in practice, we would certainly need to heed your, let's say, warning that we need to keep the complex situation as simple as possible so that it has sufficient traction also in broader communities, and that it relates certainly more directly and explicitly to a very wide range of social actors.
Thank you, Louis. So we have a question from Elizabeth. To what extent is a move to Earth system law constrained by the rules of international trade? So is it the case that we can't move to an Earth system law without first reforming trade laws?
Thank you, Elizabeth. That is a difficult question to answer because I'm not a trade lawyer at all. This is the one area of law that I've absolutely never had any interest in. But I think the same can be said of other bodies of law, even of human rights law. Perhaps more area of interest of mine. The way that we, for example, been thinking about international human rights law, even despite our assumption that human rights are good, is not necessarily conducive to opening up to an Earth systems perspective. For example, one of its staunchest critics, Inaugural, has very convincingly shown how the anthropocentric ontology, for example, of human rights prevent us from seeing humans as part of the Earth system and from extending law's object and reach of judicial care to non-human beings as well. And I think the same barriers also certainly would exist in international trade law. Perhaps it is also time to fundamentally rethink the basic premises of international trade law. Why we need it, what is the ultimate purpose of international trade law, and for our present purposes also how international trade law links with the processes and aspects that are markers both of the Anthropocene and that drive Earth system transformations. In your area of expertise, for example, including global plastics pollution, or even then trade in plastics, global trade in plastics, I can see several connection points.
Great. So we have a more philosophical question from Rob about how system is conceived. So does Earth system law presume that the Earth system is knowable in a cybernetic sense, or does this vision of law acknowledge the necessary limitations of humans' capacity to know and act as legal stewards to the system?
Well, probably both. I mean, my understanding, I can only say how I understand the system, and my understanding of a system within the context also of the bigger Earth system paradigm is that it is a materially closed system with interactive feedback loops and energy fluxes and so forth, where one element affects the other. So very much in line with the nexus approach, or telecoupling even, which tells us that if you affect one component of the system, another is also affected. So perhaps my understanding of the Earth system is much less philosophical and perhaps much more concrete and simple. So I'm afraid I can't say too much about about any philosophical take on this. As far as planetary stewardship is concerned, I think if we recognize that humans are part of the Earth system, then the obligation to become planetary stewards is all the more clear. Because then we realize that the Earth system or nature, as I've said, is not something out there to be managed by powerful, invincible humans. We, tragically and ironically, obviously, control our own fate because we are the Earth system. And I think once one appreciates that to its fullest extent, then one is better able also to appreciate the necessity of becoming active planetary stewards, because we are determining our own fate in every sense of the word.
Thank you. So I think we'll end on a very topical question from Duncan. So does an ethical approach to does this ethical approach mandate an increasingly ethical approach to climate change? So he says, does it mean that we're in the realm of keep it in the ground rather than something which is less dramatic, such as less ambitious mitigation targets?
Certainly the first. I would definitely argue that it requires that an Earth system approach and the ethical obligations of becoming planetary stewards augurs support for the argument that we would need more ambitious laws. We would need ambitious laws that are also commensurate with the ethical obligation of protection and care. Also for other vulnerable living and non-living entities of the Earth system. So in short, it certainly offers and demands a far more deeply ethical and protective, caring paradigm for the entire living order, which hopefully could help us to break down these hierarchies of power that we've been constructing through powerful states, through powerful corporations, and that are causing the terribly globally uneven world that we live in. And my concern is that we don't see enough of that happening. If I look every evening at what transpired during the day at COP27 in Glasgow, I'm not particularly encouraged that we are, as of yet, moving towards a moment in time, let's call it a global constitutional moment, where we can say this will be a sea change in how we are going to do things. And what makes this most problematic is that we are dealing with climate change, which is probably the most clear signifier of an Earth system disruptor. So if we can't see it with climate change, I highly doubt that we will be able to see it with any other Earth system processes and phenomena. So I don't want to conclude on such a utterly pessimistic note. I am deeply encouraged by very progressive work that is being done, not only by critical environmental lawyers, but also in an intra and transdisciplinary setting, political scientists, Earth system scientists, and also within and across the legal discipline itself, to explore more normatively ambitious, ethically responsible ways to respond to this interacted and integrated complex of Earth system governance challenges. Thank you.
Thank you for pulling that back, Louis. I think that's a much more positive ending there. So there is one or two extra questions. I hope that you may email us or Louis directly, and we'll attempt to get those questions answered. So before I ask you to join me in thanking Louis through the chat function, which is a very 2021 thing to do. I just want to put a plug out for our next lecture in the series, which is on the 9th of December. Professor Anna-Marie Roos will be talking about Tales of a Manuscript Lover. So do join us on the 9th of December. So thank you so much, Louis. Fascinating. I wish we could have had more questions because there's lots of stuff coming up. Please do join me in thanking Louis on the chat function. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely evening further.